End of the lecture. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Victor Gomia, who teaches in LLP, and the topic today is, I would hope, an obviously important one, the war on terrorism, and he will use his insight and knowledge of Africa to talk about the war on terror in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McPartland, for the opportunity. Thanks to everyone who is here present. I'd like to recognize the presence of the two deans here at KSU, for Professor Oleka and Professor Lake. Of course, I also thank Dr. Cynthia Shelton for linking me up to do this presentation to Dr. McPartland. This afternoon, we're going to look at Africa vis-a-vis the war on terrorism. Like Dr. McPartland just said, a very current topic, very current and also very exhaustive. I would like to just pinpoint some of the very key factors that are very important for us to be aware of. Okay, I take off with the definition of key terms, Africa and the war on terrorism. I'm looking here at terrorism as the unlawful use or threatened use of force or violence by a person or an organized group against people or property with the intention of intimidating or coercing societies or government, often for ideological or political reasons. Our focus here will be on Islamic terrorism in particular. Of course, a war here will be a state of open, armed, often prolonged conflict carried on between nations, states, or parties. Of course, we are dealing here with parties. Muslim, Islam, extremism on the other hand, and the free world on the other. I have here the map of Africa. I know very often when I introduce myself to classes at the beginning of semester here at KSU, a question that comes often is, hey, Dr. Gomia, who's the president of Africa? You know, so they want to know who the president of Africa is. And I always make an effort to explain that Africa is not a country. Africa is a continent with 54 independent sovereign countries, sovereign states. And here is the map of Africa. Unfortunately, we don't have a bigger board here, but I'm sure you can have a look at that there. Now, Africa is the world's largest and second most populous continent after Asia. With 1 billion people as of 2009, it accounts for about 14.5% of the world's human population. Pre-colonial Africa possessed perhaps as many as 10,000 different states or polities, characterized by many different sorts of political organizations and rule. Today there are 54 sovereign countries in Africa, most of which still have the borders drawn during the era of European colonization. Since colonialism, African states have frequently been hampered by instability, corruption, violence, and authoritarianism, I should say. During the period from early 60s to 80s, Africa had more than 70 coups and 13 presidential assassinations. Border and territorial disputes were also very common in the continent. Now, although it has abundant natural resources, Africa remains the world's poorest and most underdeveloped continent due to a variety of causes that may include the spread of deadly diseases and viruses, notably HIV/AIDS and malaria, corrupt governments that have often committed serious human errors and violation of human rights, failure of central planning system to coordinate effort toward the development of different countries of the continent. Poverty, illiteracy, malnutrition, and inadequate water supply and sanitation, as well as poor health, affect a very huge portion of Africa to today. This despite the development effort, despite the effort from the West to help the continent. In fact, according to World Bank economist Jeffrey Sachs, for the last 50 years, more than $2.3 trillion have been disbursed to Africa as a way of foreign aid. Yet, in Africa, we still have children dying of malaria, we have children dying of malnutrition, we have kids dying because they cannot afford clean drinking water. Now, it means that there's something wrong somewhere. It's not only about dumping foreign aid to Africa. If the $2.3 trillion could be used, could be put in adequate use, I believe there would have been much improvement in the standard of living and, of course, other facilities in the continent. The new figures that sub-Saharan Africa has been the least successful region of the world in reducing poverty. In fact, some 50% of the population living in poverty in 1981, a figure that rose to 58% in 1996 before dropping to 50% in 2005. Now, the average poor person in sub-Saharan Africa is estimated to live on less than 70 cents a day, and was poor in 2003 than he or she was in 1973. That's like 20 years or 30 years difference. So in 1973, people live better lives in Africa in some areas than they lived in 2003. Some of this is attributed to unsuccessful economic liberalization programs spearheaded by foreign companies and government. But other studies and reports have cited bad domestic government policies more than external factors. Now, if we want to know that Africa as a continent has a lot in terms of mineral resources, I mean, we've heard about that time and again, but so far we've not been able to weigh the amount of resources that are in Africa until recently, with a study by one Professor Sungi, 2008 studies, which has it that in Africa, for example, I don't know if you can see what is on the board, but I will read from my screen as well. 90% of the world's cobalt is produced or is coming from Africa, actually. 90% of the world's platinum is found in Africa. 50% of its gold is also found in Africa. Now, 98% of 98% of its chromium. Actually, Africa has 70% of its tantalite, that's the world's tantalite. 64% of its manganese and 1/3 of its uranium. Now, the DRC, this is former Zaire, alone has 70% of the world's coltan. Coltan is what is used to fix cell phones, actually. In fact, it's said that most mobile phones in the world have coltan in them. Now, the DRC also has more than 30% of the world's diamond reserves. Now, Guinea is the world's largest exporter of bauxite, still out there in Africa. I'd like us to take a look at the map you have right there on the screen. In fact, before we get to the map, I'd like to make a comment about this statistics that you have right there. As the growth in Africa has been driven mainly by services and not by manufacture or agriculture, it has been growth without jobs and without a reduction in poverty. In fact, the food security crisis of 2008, which took place on the heels of the global financial crisis, has pushed back 100 million people into food insecurity in Africa as a continent. Now, we're going to look at the degree to which Muslims inhabit the continent of Africa. You'll be surprised to learn that close to half of Africa is made of Muslims. 45% of Africa is made up of Muslims, 40% are Christians, less than 15% continue to follow their traditional African religions. There's a very tiny minority that are not religious at all. Now, a question may be asked, what has weak, failed, or rogue states in Africa got to do with the terrorism in the world? The answer to this question, to my thinking, is that in the current phase of globalization, it has virtually everything to do to the rest of the world. In an age where it is very easy to transmit information through the internet or through cable TV, what's affecting somebody in Africa, no matter how far off from the city, can also affect somebody in New York. What is happening in Kabul, for example, or let's say what's happening in Lagos in Nigeria would inextricably be linked to somebody who lives far off from Lagos, maybe in London or in New York or in Paris or in Bonn, whichever part of the world. I would like to draw your attention to a couple of instances of terrorism or terrorist attacks that are linked to Africa in the past couple of years. You'll be surprised. And the observation I make in this paper is that it is recognized by scholars, by politicians, by diplomats that Africa is a weak link in the global war against terror. But it seems to me that enough attention is not being paid to that reality. Just as recently as last October 2nd, this 2010, the Niger Delta militant group, MEN, sent an email message to media houses warning of its plan to disrupt the festivities marking the Golden Jubilee of Nigerian independence. Now, during the celebration at Eagle Square in the country's capital, Abuja, a bomb explosion killed 5 and wounded 8 people. June 2010 in Uganda, during the World Cup tournament, Somali radical Islamist group Al-Shabaab carried out 2 bomb attacks in Uganda. The bombing killed 74 soccer fans watching the World Cup final on television. Now, April 2007 in Algeria, 2 near simultaneous bomb blasts in Algiers, as the capital of that country, exploded, targeting the office of the Prime Minister Abdelaziz Bekadem, killed at least 30 people. September 2006 in Somalia, 11 people were killed in a failed assassination attempt on Somalia's transitional government. Abdullahi Yusuf Ahmed, with the president's brother and 6 of the attackers among the dead. Now, the attack was blamed on the Islamic Court Union, which controlled Mogadishu between summer of 2006 and the end of that year. April 2006 in Egypt, bombings at 3 locations in the Egyptian resort of Dahar killed 23 people, including 3 foreigners. More than 80, including many foreign tourists, were injured in that bomb blast. Security officials blamed an Islamic group in that country. July 2005, in Egypt again, 63 people, including Britons, died and more than 100 were injured by bombings in the Egyptian resort of Sharm el-Sheikh. Two of the attacks were suicide car bombings, while a 3rd device was planted. Now, an Islamist group claimed responsibility for that bomb blast. Still in Egypt, Egypt is in North Africa. I'm going to show you the map because of this conversation. Still in Egypt in April 2005, 3 foreign tourists were killed by a suicide bomber at the Khan Khalili market in Cairo. Cairo is the capital of Egypt. 3 weeks later, a bomb was detonated in another incident linked to the same militant group, and a tourist coach was sprayed with bullets. There were no fatalities in those attacks. Now, October 2004, still in Egypt, 3 terror attacks in resorts and hotels in Taba, near Nuweiban, the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt, killed 33 people and injured